Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus entered the world on a cold December night in 37 AD, not with the soft cries of a newborn, but into a palace echoing with screams of betrayal and political slaughter. Rome, under the erratic reign of Emperor Caligula, was a cesspool of violence and indulgence. Men died for glancing the wrong way, women were bartered like coin. And amid that storm, a boy was born to a woman even more feared than the emperor himself, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was no ordinary mother. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, niece of Caligula, and a master strategist in the blood-drenched game of imperial politics. She didn't cradle her child with lullabies. Instead, she whispered to him lessons in manipulation, betrayal, and survival. To her, Lucius wasn't a son, he was a weapon, a living instrument of vengeance and ambition sharpened from the cradle. His bloodline was cursed and royal all at once. His father, Domitius Ahenobarbus, had been a cruel and corrupt consul who once remarked that nothing good could ever come from a woman like Agrippina bearing his child. But Agrippina had a different vision. She didn't care what the omens said. She would carve a throne out of corpses if needed, and crown her son with her own hands. Caligula, her brother, exiled her shortly after Lucius's birth, casting mother and child into disgrace. But exile only hardened her resolve. When Caligula was murdered and Claudius, her half-uncle, became emperor, Agrippina saw an opening. A path paved in incest and poison, yes, but a path nonetheless. She returned to Rome, seduced her aging uncle, and married him. The whispers of disgust and horror from the Senate and nobility didn't matter. In their eyes, it was a monstrosity. In hers, it was destiny. One by one, rivals fell. Claudius's own children were sidelined or mysteriously sickened. And in the heart of the palace, Agrippina's son watched, learned, absorbed it all. The lies, the flattery, the killings. By the age of 12, Lucius could smile while slipping a blade between a friend's ribs. In 50 AD, Agrippina achieved her greatest coup, convincing Claudius to adopt Lucius as his son and heir. The boy took on a new name, Nero, a name that would one day be spoken in fear across the known world. But already the transformation had begun. This was no longer a child. This was a creature molded by ambition, fed on revenge, and birthed not from love, but from madness. Rome had no idea that the worst emperor in its history had already been crowned, in a mother's heart. And Agrippina? She believed she could control him. She was wrong. Nero did not grow up surrounded by stories of heroism or the virtues of mercy. He was not taught to lead, but to outmaneuver, outlast, and outlive. Agrippina, ever the architect of ambition, shaped her son like a weapon, polished on the outside, but honed for blood. While other boys learned philosophy and military tactics, Nero learned the art of the smile that conceals a blade. By the time he was 10, he had already witnessed more poisonings than poems. Agrippina whispered secrets into his ear as he lay in bed: how to spot betrayal in a man's eyes, how to read a lie by the way a servant bows. At state banquets, she would point discreetly to a senator and murmur, "That man will not survive winter," and she was always right. The most pivotal moment in Nero's transformation came in 50 AD, when Emperor Claudius, aged, weary, and increasingly manipulated by Agrippina's charms, adopted Nero as his own son. This act sealed Britannicus's fate. Britannicus, Claudius's biological heir, had once been the pride of the palace. But with Agrippina's whispers and Nero's rehearsed charm, Claudius was swayed. A boy molded for shadows was now cloaked in purple. From that moment forward, the empire began to rot from within. Nero didn't yet have a throne, but he had something even more dangerous: legitimacy and patience. He watched Britannicus from afar, studied him, mimicked his manners. Then slowly he began to replace him. Tutors once assigned to Britannicus were reassigned to Nero. Senators began bowing lower to the adopted son. Even the Praetorian Guard, sensing the shift in favor, started offering discreet loyalty. And Agrippina, ever behind the curtain, pulled strings with surgical precision. She placed allies in key positions. She curried favor with the army and religious orders. She began spreading quiet doubts about Britannicus's fragile health and unstable disposition. Meanwhile, Nero learned how to kill without touching a blade. He studied poisons, how they worked, how long they took, what symptoms they produced. He practiced facial expressions in the mirror, mastering the art of grief that masked satisfaction. He learned to mourn with dry eyes. By 51 AD, Claudius had bestowed upon Nero the title Princeps Juventutis, the leader of the youth, a title that often preceded elevation to emperor. The writing was on the palace walls, etched in ambition and venom. Britannicus, now a ghost in his own home, wandered the marble halls like a forgotten heir, while Nero smiled beside the emperor, polished like gold and just as cold. The boy was no longer being forged. He was ready to be used. Nero was only 16 when he ascended the imperial throne, the youngest emperor Rome had ever seen. To the Senate and the public, he appeared charming, well-spoken, and full of youthful promise. They saw a golden boy guided by wise mentors like Seneca and Burrus. But beneath the purple robes and rehearsed gestures of humility, a storm had already begun to churn. A storm fueled by paranoia, entitlement, and the taste of power. One name haunted Nero's path: Britannicus. The legitimate son of Emperor Claudius, Britannicus was not just a symbol of what could have been. He was a living reminder that Nero's claim to power was secondhand, engineered through adoption and deception. Though Britannicus had been sidelined for years, he was now approaching manhood. Every inch he grew was a threat. Every gaze from a senator, every nod from a soldier, every whispered loyalty toward the true heir chipped away at Nero's confidence. He had not worked so hard, shed so much blood in silence, only to watch it unravel at the hands of a boy. And so, on a cold Roman evening, Nero orchestrated a performance far more chilling than any he would ever deliver on stage. The banquet hall glittered with wealth: golden goblets, ivory platters, dancers twirling beneath painted ceilings. Laughter flowed freely, but tension laced the air. At the emperor's table sat Britannicus, his face pale but composed. He was offered a goblet of wine, as was customary. It had already been tested for poison by the cupbearer, a ritual meant to guarantee safety. But Nero had planned every detail. The wine was too hot. Britannicus, in a soft voice, requested cold water. The servant, hand trembling ever so slightly, poured water from a separate jug, one secretly laced with a fast-acting toxin. It was said to be odorless, tasteless, but lethal within seconds. The boy took a sip, first nothing, then a sudden clutching of his throat. His eyes widened. He gasped. He fell. All noise in the room ceased. Goblets froze midair. One dancer stumbled in silence. Britannicus convulsed once, then collapsed onto the table, face twisted in agony. Nero did not flinch. He merely turned to his guests and calmly remarked that Britannicus had always been prone to epileptic fits. Seneca said nothing. Burrus looked down. Agrippina, once the puppet master, watched her son from across the hall, her expression unreadable. That night, the empire understood. Nero was no boy. He was not a figurehead. He was not to be negotiated with, advised, or controlled. He was a predator who had tasted blood and found it empowering. Britannicus's death was not simply an execution. It was a declaration, a crown drenched in poison, a warning to Rome. If I can murder my own brother at dinner, imagine what I will do to you. Power had changed Nero, but it had also changed Agrippina. Once the architect of her son's meteoric rise, Agrippina now found herself unwelcome in the empire she had built. The throne she had carved out of manipulation and blood no longer held space for her. She had envisioned ruling through her son, pulling strings from the shadows while he wore the crown. But Nero had grown teeth, and more dangerously, he had grown tired of her. At first, she remained in the palace, giving orders as though she were still the true sovereign. She attended Senate meetings, intercepted diplomatic letters, and even sat beside her son during audiences with foreign envoys. To the Roman elite, it was clear: The boy emperor was merely a puppet in the hands of his mother. But Nero wasn't a boy anymore, and he hated the strings. Their relationship, once forged in ambition, began to crack. Agrippina's tone turned harsh, critical. She belittled his decisions, questioned his appointments, and, most damning of all, openly disapproved of his romantic life. When Nero took interest in a freed woman of humble birth, Agrippina erupted with fury. To her, Act was a disgrace, an insult to the bloodline of Augustus, a threat to the imperial image she had so carefully sculpted. Nero, however, found something intoxicating in Act's simplicity. Unlike the calculating women of court, Act admired him without agenda. For the first time, Nero felt seen as a man, not a project. Agrippina responded with threats. She reminded him that his adoption could be revoked, that Britannicus's memory still lingered, and that the Senate only bowed to him because she commanded it. She even began to subtly suggest that perhaps Rome would be better served by a different emperor, a hint that chilled Nero's blood. Whether she meant Britannicus, had he lived, or another noble child she could elevate, her intentions were clear. She was not done playing kingmaker. But Nero had heard enough. He no longer saw his mother as his greatest ally. He saw her as a rival. Worse, as a usurper, someone who had created a monster she could no longer control. The palace halls, once filled with whispered counsel, became battlegrounds of silent defiance. Courtiers learned to avoid them when they crossed paths. Servants moved between them like shadows, careful not to take sides. The once unbreakable bond between mother and son had rotted into fear and suspicion. Nero began removing her portraits from public temples. Her guards were dismissed, her privileges revoked. And though she was still his mother, still the empress in all but title, she now found herself exiled within her own empire, her influence fading like a dying torch. But Agrippina was not a woman to go quietly. She had survived emperors, coups, exile, and scandal. And now, sensing that her own son might be plotting something darker, she began preparing her defenses, gathering allies, shielding herself from poison, watching the shadows. By now, Nero's hatred for his mother had evolved into something far more dangerous than resentment. It had become obsession. Agrippina was no longer just a political nuisance or a faded shadow from his childhood. She was a threat, a living symbol of the power he still hadn't completely wrestled away. She knew too much. She had built him, and she could unmake him. But murder, especially matricide, was a different league of crime in Rome. It wasn't just taboo. It was a stain upon the soul. A man could butcher senators, generals, even wives, and still be emperor. But a mother? That was sacrilege. So Nero, theatrical as always, plotted a murder worthy of the stage. He would make her death seem like an accident. Pleasure cruise, a surprise gift, a gesture of reconciliation. That was the illusion. The reality, a death trap on water. He ordered the construction of a beautifully adorned boat. Gilded rails, satin cushions, carved panels depicting peaceful sea scenes. But beneath its splendor hid sinister mechanisms. A floor rigged to collapse and a canopy weighted to crush anyone beneath. When Agrippina stepped aboard, she was not entering a gift. She was stepping into a floating coffin. The night was calm. The moon bathed the bay in silver. Nero stood on the shore, watching as the boat drifted into deeper waters. He imagined the splash, the screams, then silence. But fate had a different script. As the mechanism triggered, the floor gave way. One of Agrippina's handmaidens was thrown into the sea and perished instantly. The canopy, meant to fall and crush Agrippina, malfunctioned. And she, ever the survivor, did what no one expected. She remained calm. She swam, her body bruised, her robe soaked in seawater and blood. She made it to the shore under the cover of night. Fishermen found her. She said little, but her eyes burned with fury. She understood what had happened. She knew who had planned it. And most of all, she knew Nero had failed. News of her miraculous survival spread quickly, whispered like a ghost story through the streets of Rome. The empress who wouldn't die. The mother who swam from death. Nero's perfectly choreographed tragedy had turned into a farce. He panicked. Not only had he failed to kill her, but now she was furious, exposed, and dangerous. She would not go quietly. She had allies, secrets, and motive. And worst of all, she had nothing left to lose. The death boat had not claimed its intended victim, but it had made Nero desperate. And desperation in a tyrant's heart is often the final spark before the true fire begins. The sea had failed him. Nero, once the emperor of performance and illusion, had carefully constructed a masterpiece of theatrical murder. A death boat meant to drown his mother in elegance and silence. But instead of a quiet disappearance, Agrippina had returned from the waves like a specter risen from the dead. Bruised but unbroken, humiliated, Nero now faced the one opponent he could not manipulate, charm, or poison from afar, his own mother. The failure broke something in him. Gone was the veneer of diplomacy. The actor's mask slipped, revealing raw desperation. He no longer wanted Agrippina removed with subtlety. He wanted her gone. Now, permanently. And so, he did what all tyrants eventually do when fear swallows their cunning. He reached for the sword. He summoned Anicetus, the fleet commander, a man once loyal to Agrippina but now firmly under Nero's thumb. The message was simple: finish what the ocean could not. Under the cover of night, a band of assassins was dispatched to Agrippina's coastal villa. She had been recovering there, her wounds still healing, her mind racing. But she was not naive. When her guards mysteriously disappeared and the torches outside went dim, she knew what was coming. She did not run. She did not scream. When the assassins burst into her chamber, swords drawn, they found the former empress standing tall in a crimson robe, framed by the flickering glow of a single oil lamp. Her gaze was calm, colder than steel. According to legend, she bared her chest and pointed to her stomach. "Strike here," she said, voice unwavering. "In the womb that bore the monster." It was not a plea. It was an order, and they obeyed. The first thrust cut deep. The second silenced her forever. Blood pooled on the marble floor, glistening like rubies. The assassins stood in frozen silence for a moment. Not out of guilt, but awe. They had just killed the woman who had shaped emperors, manipulated gods, and survived more conspiracies than most men dreamed. Word reached Nero before sunrise. At first he felt triumph, relief. He had finally severed the last thread of control. But then came the silence of Rome, the silence of his dreams, the silence of guilt disguised as shadows in the hallway, as the chill that crept into his bones at night. Agrippina was dead, yes, but she had won something in death that she had lost in life. She had become eternal. And Nero, now fully untethered, was no longer a boy nor a son. He was a creature ruled by paranoia, stained with his own mother's blood. A mother who, in her final breath, made sure he would never forget who gave him life, and who would now haunt his every step. With Agrippina gone, Nero felt something unfamiliar: untethered freedom. There were no more scolding eyes watching from the shadows, no more veiled threats wrapped in maternal concern. He was alone, and for the first time he was unchallenged. But freedom didn't elevate him. It unhinged him. No longer content to rule as an emperor, Nero began performing like a man possessed. He fancied himself a god of the stage, a master of music, poetry, and spectacle. He demanded Rome not only obey him, but applaud him. The imperial court was forced to attend recitals where Nero sang tragic verses, plucked a lyre, or acted in melodramas, his face covered in grease paint and sweat. Senators dared not yawn. Generals dared not glance away. To fail to clap was to invite suspicion. And so the Roman elite clapped until their hands ached. He raced chariots before cheering crowds, demanded statues of himself in the garb of Apollo, and forced noble families to fund lavish theater competitions in which he always emerged victorious. Nero didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be adored as a divine artist. The empire groaned beneath the weight of his narcissism. But the stage could not satisfy the monster forming beneath the crown. Nero's personal life grew darker with each passing year. His wife, Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, had been a political match, a symbol of dynastic unity. But she was quiet, dignified, and above all unloved by Nero. As he fell deeper under the spell of his mistress, the enchanting but ruthless Poppaea Sabina, Nero's patience with Octavia withered. When whispers of infidelity, likely false and fabricated, reached his ears, Nero seized the excuse. Octavia was arrested, exiled, and later executed. Her head was presented to Poppaea as a gift. Rome mourned her, but Nero sang louder. Yet even Poppaea, the woman he once adored, could not escape the shadow of his unraveling soul. She was pregnant with his child, a moment that should have softened the blood-stained emperor. But one evening, in a fit of rage over a minor disagreement, Nero kicked her in the belly. She collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath her. She never rose again. The emperor who wept for actors on stage had murdered his unborn child and the woman he claimed to love. His palace echoed not with lullabies, but with screams. Rome no longer feared a tyrant. It watched, in horrified awe, as a madman took the stage. A man who composed arias while bodies cooled, who demanded applause with blood still fresh on his hands. He had killed his mother, his wife, his lover, and now only the world remained. The summer of 64 AD scorched Rome not with sunlight, but with fire. It began in the dead of night, flames erupting near the Circus Maximus. Fueled by wooden buildings, summer winds, and narrow alleys, the fire spread like a living thing. Within hours, entire districts were engulfed in towering infernos. Families screamed, roofs collapsed, marble statues melted into molten slag. The sky over the eternal city turned red with ash, and for 6 nights and 7 days, the empire's beating heart was consumed. When the flames finally died, 10 of Rome's 14 districts lay in ruin. Thousands were homeless. Temples, markets, homes gone. And where was the emperor? According to whispers, soon to become legend, Nero stood atop the Palatine Hill, dressed in theatrical robes, strumming his lyre as the city burned. Some claimed he sang of the fall of Troy, imagining himself a poetic witness to divine destruction. Others swore they saw him smiling. Whether he truly lit the match or merely sang beside the flames, it didn't matter to the people. Rome had suffered, and the emperor seemed to revel in it. Then came the construction. With much of the central city reduced to ash, Nero seized the opportunity. He ordered the building of a new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. A sprawling monument of excess, it would cover over 100 acres of prime land, complete with artificial lakes, gilded halls, and rotating dining rooms. Where citizens once lived, the emperor would now feast. But the people were not blind. Grief turned to rage. Whispers grew into accusations. He burned the city, they said, to build his dream in gold. Cornered by public fury, Nero did what many tyrants have done before and since. He turned their hatred elsewhere. He blamed the Christians. At the time, Christians were a small, unpopular sect, mistrusted, secretive, and already under suspicion for their refusal to worship Roman gods. They were easy targets. Nero unleashed a terror upon them unmatched in Roman memory. Some were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. Others were crucified along the roads leading into Rome, their bodies left as warnings. Most grotesquely, many were covered in pitch and set alight, human torches used to illuminate Nero's garden feasts. As he wandered those glowing pathways, goblet in hand, surrounded by laughter and song, the emperor no longer needed fire to destroy Rome. He had found a new fuel, fear. Rome did not just burn with flame. It burned with the knowledge that its ruler no longer saw his people as subjects, but as scenery in his personal theater of madness. And above the smoke, the golden walls of Domus Aurea rose, gleaming like a tomb for the soul of the empire. The ashes of Rome had barely cooled before Nero sought a scapegoat. He had built his golden palace upon the ruins of people's homes, and the whispers had grown into roars. He did it. He burned Rome. The fury of the people simmered, and even Nero's most loyal senators could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. So Nero, ever the performer, created a new act, one of blood, fire, and terror. And he chose the perfect targets, the Christians. They were a fledgling sect, foreign, defiant, and secretive. They worshipped a crucified man. They rejected the gods of Rome. They spoke of a kingdom not of this world. To the public, they were strange. To Nero, they were expendable. He accused them of the Great Fire. The people wanted someone to blame, and Nero handed them victims wrapped in silence and prayer. Thus began one of the most gruesome persecutions in the history of the empire. Hundreds were rounded up, men, women, children. Some were forced into beast skins and thrown into arenas where wild dogs tore them apart while Roman citizens cheered. Others were crucified along the roads leading to the city, rows of broken bodies lining the Appian Way like warnings carved in flesh. But the most horrifying spectacle came at night. In Nero's imperial gardens, he threw elaborate parties filled with wine, music, and laughter. Noble guests in embroidered masks feasted under silk tents, while the gardens glowed with light. Not from lanterns, from people. Christians, coated in pitch, were tied to stakes and set on fire, burning alive to illuminate the pathways. Their screams were masked by music, their shadows dancing grotesquely on palace walls. Nero called it a celebration of justice. The nobles called it madness, but none dared speak it aloud. And as the flames crackled, Nero would walk among them in embroidered robes, goblet in hand, reciting poetry and basking in the orange glow of burning flesh. It was no longer tyranny. It was theater, a theater of cruelty. Rome, once the jewel of the civilized world, was now a city haunted by the scent of burning bodies. Parents told their children not to speak above whispers. Senators avoided Nero's gaze. The empire held its breath as the emperor lit up the night with human torches and called it art. The Christians became martyrs. But Nero became something else entirely. Not just a madman, nor a murderer. He became a god in his own eyes, one who demanded applause not for mercy or wisdom, but for how beautifully he could make people burn. As Nero's reign grew darker, Rome began to crack under the weight of his madness. The fire, the cruelty, the murders, each act drove him further from reality and closer to the edge. Senators no longer whispered in corners. Generals began to question. And the people, the very citizens who once cheered his games, now watched him with quiet hatred. The spark came in the form of a name, Gaius Calpurnius Piso. A respected nobleman, Piso led a conspiracy, carefully woven between senators, equestrians, poets, philosophers, and even members of Nero's own Praetorian Guard. Their plan was simple: remove the tyrant before he could destroy what remained of Rome. But the plan unraveled before it could be lit. A freedwoman named Epicharus, too eager or too bold, revealed fragments of the plot to a fleet commander who turned loyalist. Under torture, names spilled. Arrests followed. Nero, consumed by paranoia, unleashed a reign of terror. Hundreds were tortured, executed, or forced to take their own lives. Among them was Seneca, the philosopher who had once been Nero's tutor, his moral compass. Ordered to die, Seneca opened his veins in a steaming bath and dictated his final words with calm dignity. His death, quiet and reflective, stood in stark contrast to the storm that now devoured Rome. Nero became a prisoner of his own palace. He filled the halls with mirrors to see if anyone approached behind him. He avoided the Senate. He performed constantly, singing, acting, reciting poems, desperate to drown the screams in his head with forced applause. But the applause faded. The army turned. The Senate declared him a public enemy. And Rome, his stage, finally turned off the lights. When Nero learned that rebel troops were approaching the city, he begged for someone, anyone, to help him flee. But his guards had vanished. His advisors had disappeared. He was no longer the emperor. He was a man alone. He fled to a villa outside the city, accompanied only by a few terrified slaves. There, hiding in the shadows of a decaying estate, He waited for the inevitable. "I have neither friend nor foe left," he whispered. When news came that soldiers were moments away, Nero knew the end had arrived. But death, when stripped of ceremony, terrified him. He shook, he sobbed, and when even suicide seemed beyond his courage, he begged a servant to help drive the blade. As steel pierced his throat, his final words, choked and barely audible, were, "What an artist dies in me." Thus fell the emperor who had murdered his mother, burned his people, and drenched the empire in terror. Nero's body was buried in secret. His memory was condemned by the Senate. But his legacy, it burned like Rome long after he was gone.